Hi, welcome to SQL and Introduction to Basics, where we'll be covering a few basics about this topic and hope a few beginners will learn how to write their first set of queries. Just to give you a brief overview, in part 1 we'll be talking about SQL, database, data and how all these relate to each other. Part 2 we'll be looking at the SQL environment and maybe downloading certain software that we'll need. Part 3 will be looking at writing the SQL queries and executing them. So what's SQL? It's nothing but structured query language. Similar to Java and C++, which are called programming languages, SQL is a query language which will help us query against, let's say, databases and tables. What do we do with SQL? We write what are called SQL queries and make them work against databases to store data or also to retrieve data. In this tutorial, our concentration will be on retrieving data. So what's data? It's nothing but a collection of facts or particulars. Here we have a few details about our friends, let's say. All this constitutes data. Data can also be on Google pages, Twitter comments, Facebook, you name it. Data exists everywhere. Where is this data stored? Sometimes it could be in Excel files, for example, or even text files. Excel files, a lot of people love using those for storing financial data, for example. Could also have data in database and tables. Here we have a table called famous actors, which is stored in this database. Another table called famous movies of the same actors is also stored in the same database. So database can have one or more or several, let's say, related tables. For a query to work, structured data is a must. Here we have certain contacts listed where data are stored in columns or fields. We have 4 columns here: last name, first name, email and cell phone, and each of these has a data type behind it. For us, the data type in this contact is all character. Data could also be date time or integer or several other types, which we'll be looking at a little bit later. Now, we also have rows or records. These columns and rows is what constitutes a structured data, and what's actually stored is called value. SQL environment. Let's look at what we actually need for a SQL query to work. Where do we run a SQL query? We can look at so many environments where SQL queries can be written and executed: Java, SAS, .NET, Excel, just to name a few. We also have something called the relational database management systems, where we have databases, tables, and also query tools that will help us run SQL queries. In this tutorial, we'll be using mostly MS SQL Server. What components do we need to run a query? If you have data in an Excel file, you don't need a whole lot actually. You'll probably be using sort and filter and several other features available to filter out the data and generate the results that you need. If you have a database query, you will need a database, at least one table, and a user ID and password to actually access the table in the database. Like we have similar to our email accounts that are protected using a user ID and password. Databases also have user IDs and passwords. Additionally, we'll need what are called query tools, where we write the SQL statements and execute them. Certain systems also come with what are called query builders, where we have one or more tables that are related to a database, and several drag drop features can be utilized to actually generate the SQL statement, and we don't have to write the queries in this case. However, since we are just getting started, we'll be writing the query statements ourselves. Since we'll be using SQL Server, I've listed a few SQL Server links that you can use to download the free software, and YouTube has several videos on how to download the software, set up the databases, create tables, etc. This is what we'll be needing to actually write our queries. I will be using Microsoft SQL Server Express. Let's look at the SQL syntax. We have a few parts to it. First thing is what to select. For that we have the select clause and then the column names that are separated by commas. We'll look at the all and distinct a little bit later. Next is where do we select the data from. For that we have the from clause followed by the table name from which we want to select the data. We have certain other optional statements like a where statement which will allow us to select a subset of the data based on certain conditions. You can also use the order by to sort the columns in ascending or descending order. By the way, once again the column names have to be separated by commas. This is a must. Select from, where and order by, all, distinct, ascending, descending, or all of these are called keywords. Select from, where and order by must be used in this order only. We'll take a look at what happens if the order is ever changed. If we write a query in one environment, will it work in another? For that, the American National Standards Institute has come up with certain standards so that developers will find it easier to write queries in several environments. But a few tweaks are always necessary when the environment changes, and that's something we all need to pay attention to. But follow these standards and you're good to go. I'll be using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio to help us execute certain query statements. So let's get started with that. Here I'm going to open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Normally you would use SQL Server Authentication and enter your user ID and password over here. Mine is set up to use Windows Authentication and I'm connecting. Here is the databases that you can find. Some of these have been set up by the system. And I have actually created a database called Test Contacts. If you want to create one, right click on the databases and use the new database feature. Enter all the required information and your database is ready to go. Next thing is you want to create a table in the database. For that purpose, you would need to enter a lot of information in SQL Server. So I'm going to use an Excel file where I already have my data entered, and I'll be using the import feature in SQL Server to import this information, and then a table will be created. Let's look at that now. For that I'm going to select the database name, tasks, import data, and then next. I'm going to select Microsoft Excel as my data source. Get to the file where I have the data, then choose next. I want to make sure my database has the appropriate name wherever I want to actually the data to be loaded. Click on next, copy data. Here is where I see the Excel file sheets. I'm going to select main contacts and change my destination table name to be main contact. Next. Run immediately, finish. 15 rows of data have been imported. Now let me refresh the database. And there you go. I have my table main contact that's been created here. Now if you look at the columns, the import feature has automatically set the data types. So each column must have a data type. And here you notice last name, first name, etc. are all n-varchar, which means they are characters. ID is a float, which means it's a numeric value. Birth date is a datetime feature. So all this information has been set up automatically during the import functionality. If you want to create your own table, you can right click on tables, new table, and then you would enter all the required column names, data types, and also enter the data. And then you have your database table ready. Before we actually start writing the SQL statements, let's do a few tweaks and learn a few things within MS SQL Server. There is a new query button which is what will help us create a query window. So let's click on that. And there you go, a query window has opened up. It's important to make sure that your database here is the proper one, because there could be several databases available on a server. So you want to make sure that your database is selected correctly in this box. Now let's go to Tools Options, and under Environment Fonts and Colors, I have changed the font size to 14 so that you guys can see the query statements and I'm typing out. Another thing is, if you go to Text Editor, Transact SQL General, there's a display line numbers. I'm going to check that and see what happens. As you can see, the line numbers are coming up here in this query window. This feature is actually helpful when we want to check where our errors are happening, especially when you have really long queries. This feature is extremely helpful. Now SQL Server comes up with what is called IntelliSense, this box that you see, and it displays all the databases and so much other information which I find a bit confusing. So I want to turn this feature off and make my life a little bit easier. So I go to Transact SQL IntelliSense and disable the feature. For it to work, I'm going to select a new query and close the old one. So now when I type my statement, I don't see IntelliSense anymore. One other thing to know is, before you write a query, how to put comments in here. To write block comments, you would type /* and then write your comment, and then close it using */, and this actually comments out a whole block of statements. Okay? If you want to comment out just a single line, then you can use hyphen or -- and then that single line of statement is commented out. So we have the table ready, database ready, and we saw a few neat features that can help us get started with our queries. So let's see what's next. Now the first thing is, we want to look at the select and from clauses. If you want to select all the columns from a table, the normal syntax is select * from and then the table name. Here you don't need to specify every single column. It will select all the columns just as they appear in the table. Now if I want to select specified columns, then I can say select column 1 name, comma, column 2 name, and then the table name. So you can specify each column and separate them by commas. If you want to select distinct values across specified columns, then you can use the select and the keyword distinct and the column names once again separated by commas, and then the from and table name. So let's write the queries and see how they work out. I'm going to say select * from main contact. So when I execute, then I see the results in the query window. Let me pull this up a little bit so you can see it better. One thing to note is, the number of rows of data selected is always displayed at the bottom here. So it's kind of easy for us to figure out how many rows of data have been extracted. Now one thing is, if I want to select an individual column, I would use first name, comma. Let's say you don't want to type out the column names. You can drag and drop the column names from this table actually. And then I can execute, and it just gives me the specified columns that I want to. Now you can use as many spaces between the column names, nothing matters, and the names themselves, the names of columns can be in mixed case. As you can see, the first name column in the table, F is in uppercase and N is in uppercase, whereas here I have typed everything in lowercase, but it still selects the data. That's because Microsoft SQL Server is actually not case sensitive as far as column names are concerned. The values in the columns are a different matter altogether, and we'll see that when we come to the where clause actually. So you can have as many spaces, anything, but this comma between the columns is a must. So we saw how to select all the columns where we used select star, specified columns using the column names separated by commas. Now what happens if I say select distinct last name? As you can see, we have about 15 rows of data here. If I use distinct, let's see how many rows of data it selects. Since there are two people with the same last name called Rao, it has selected only 14 rows of data. So the distinct is filtering out and making sure that the last name is distinct. Now if I add the first name column, let's see what happens. Now the distinct has to be applied across the columns last name and first name. So when I execute this, now it's going to select all the 15 rows of data. So select from which are the most important conditions that are always a must are what we saw right now. Let's get to the next condition. We have looked at the select and from, so let's look at the where clause now. As I mentioned, where selects a subset of the data, so it's not necessary all the time. But if you want to specifically select certain rows from the table, then you can use the where condition. So here is the where after the from clause. You say the column name, use an operator and the value that you want to select. You can also use several column operator value combinations, and those are separated by an and or, which we'll be looking at shortly, so don't worry about it. This is just a general syntax. Now let's look at the operators. Some of the operators that everybody commonly uses are equal, not equal, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. In this tutorial, we'll be covering these operators mostly. Between, like and in are actually going to be talked about in another class. So let's look at some examples now. I have select ID, first name, last name, birth date, gender from main contact. So let me include the where condition. I can say where ID equals 1. If your ID column is of type integer, float or any kind of number, then you don't need to put the value in quotes. Here is the operator, here is the column, and here is the value. The value doesn't need to be in quotes if it's an integer. So now let's see, execute, and it selects just that one particular row where ID number is 1, which is for William Schroeder. If I want to use first name equals John. Now here you notice, because first name is an varchar or n varchar, which means it's a character, I have to use quotes after the equal. Actually the value has to be included in quotes. Now let's execute this, and if you notice, it selected the row where first name is John. As I mentioned, Microsoft SQL Server is not case sensitive. The first name John has J in uppercase. Now if I specify the value in my where condition all in lowercase, can still execute the query and get the data. But please be aware that this doesn't work in every environment. I think Oracle probably won't work, or there are some other environments where case sensitivity is applied and you have to specify it, the value just as it appears in the table, only then the query works. But for Microsoft SQL, we are good to go. We don't have such issues. So we looked at the equal operator. Now if I have birth date, what do I do with that? That too is included in quotes. You can also say 10/10/2000, and then it brings up the data. Actually we have two people here, so it selected the data. You can specify in month, day, year order, and it selects the data, but it must be put in quotes actually, otherwise it won't work. By the way, one particular thing to note is if you highlight a statement and execute, only the highlighted statement will be executed. So please be aware that if you select a row and execute, you may get errors. If I select the whole query, then execution is easy. Or if you have just one query, you can execute it and it works without any problems. Now let's look at the not equal to and say 10, 10, 2000. So this is another operator where I'm selecting where birth date is not equal to 10, 10, 2000. Remember we had 15 rows of data. Now two people had 10, 10, 2000 and they are eliminated. So 13 rows of data have been selected here. Okay, this is how the not equal to works. Just to show you something, the operators that we will be using are equal, not equal, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So let's do, so we have already looked at equal and not equal. Let's look at greater than and probably select 1985 323. Okay, 0323 1985. Let's see how many rows of data it selects. So here you notice all the birth dates are over 323 1985. Only those rows have been selected. Now if I say greater than or equal to, then it will include that additional row where Mary Mitchell has birth date as March 23rd 1985. Now if I say less than 323 1985, so 8 rows of data have been selected, and as you notice all these birth dates are before March 23rd 1985. So this is how you would use all the operators. If I say less than or equal to, now it included even Mary Mitchell as part of the selection. So this is how you can use all the operators specified and just get the data that you want to. Now how would you use the and or? Let's look at the and first. Okay, I say include and first name equals Satya. So here I am saying the birth date must be greater than March 23rd 1985 and the first name must be equal to Satya Rao. So it selected just that one particular row. In this case, both the conditions of birth date being greater than March 23rd and first name must be Satya Rao. Both these conditions have to be satisfied. Only then the row will get selected. Now, as you can see, we can mix and match several columns. It doesn't have to be only birth date. The and can be used amongst different columns also. So we have birth date on one hand and we are also using the first name on the other hand. You can also say and birth date is less than or equal to 10, 10, 2000. Now as you can see, we are saying birthday must be greater than March 23rd and it must be less than October 10th, 2000. So these are all conditions. You can mix and match your operators and conditions in any way you want to, but please make sure the conditions are correct. Only then the proper data will be selected. The system will not be able to identify the errors in this case. It's left to us to write the queries correctly. So if you can mix and match operators as I said, and make sure that your data is getting selected correctly. Now if I use or, all the 15 rows of data have been selected here because I said birth date can be greater than or equal to March 23rd, 1985, or birth date can be less than October 10th, 2000, which means everybody pretty much has been, all the rows of data have been selected. So this is generally how you would use a combination of the operators and the conditions and or to separate one or more where clauses. So you can try out as many combinations as possible and see how things work out. Let's look at the order by clause now. Basically, we include an order by statement after select and from. As you learnt earlier, the where condition is actually optional. So if we have it, we would include it after the from and before order by. But if where is eliminated, you can include the order by directly after the from clause. So in the order by, you specify the columns that you want to order in ascending or descending order, and you can specify more than one column and separate them by commas. The default sort order is ascending. As you notice, I haven't included any keyword ASE here, which means sort the columns in ascending. That's because it's the default and the system already knows that the columns must be ordered in ascending. Now what's the other way? You can also sort by descending order. For that you would have to specify the keyword DESC after the column name where you want to sort the column in descending order. So these are the two ways in which you can sort. So let's look at some examples. Here I have select first name, last name, birth date, gender from my table, and let's include the order by birth date. Once I execute, as you can see, it has been sorted in ascending order and I didn't have to include the keyword ASC. That's the default. Now if I want to sort in descending order, obviously I have to specify the keyword. If you execute now, you can see that the data are sorted in descending order of birth date. If I want to include an additional column, I can say order by first name after the birth date. So let's see what it does now. As you can see, John appears first before Miriam. They both have the same birth date. So it has been sorted. Within the birth dates, the first names are sorted in ascending order. So that's how these order by clauses work. What happens if I specify and say even first name needs to be in descending order? As you can see now, Miriam Stanford appears first before John Michael. So this is how you can include all your ascending and descending clauses in the order by statement. If I choose not to include the birth date, would this statement still work? Let's say I remove it from the select condition. It would still work, but however, it doesn't make sense because you really cannot see how the data are actually sorted in descending order of birth date unless the column is actually included here. So it makes sense to always include your order by column within the select statement. So what next? Let's look at some common mistakes that we make while executing our queries. One of the common things that we usually do is mistype a keyword. As you can see here in the query tool, it will automatically remove the blue highlight. So we immediately know something is wrong, but just in case you don't notice it, I'm going to remove the descending. You execute it and it clearly shows you that something is wrong near the keyword from. So that means it's missing a select or some other statement. So if we put that back in, then it will work properly. Let's say by mistake, I type my where clause after the select, where first name equals John. In this case too, it will tell you there is an incorrect syntax near keyword from. So obviously you know you cannot interchange these clauses. They must be in the order of select, from, where. If you have the where clause, it has to come after the from, and order by if you have it. It's the last statement that you can use actually. Now if we forget to include, let's say, the comma between the columns, this is a very common mistake that most of us make. Let's see what it does. Select first name. Okay. As you can see, it renamed the first name column as last name, and then it's selecting it. So this mistake is something that the system won't be able to identify. It is we as users who have to pay attention to these commas between columns. And if we make a mistake, there's nothing wrong. Please try out and make as many mistakes as possible and try to fix them. Only then you will learn how to actually type the proper query statements. Now let's say I mistyped the table name. Then it's obviously, in this case, the system cannot find the table name, so it will tell you invalid object name main con. So it knows that there is no such table, and we can fix the error as necessary. And then of course things start working fine. So these are some of the common mistakes. Please try out all the queries and hope you learned something from this tutorial, and see you next time. Thank you for watching.